Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish and Broadcasting Scotland. I'm joined today by novelist, playwright and performer Alan Bissett and the fabulous Linda Fabiani MSP. And it's great to be back. I've been off the last couple of weeks with the dreaded lurgy, so it's nice to be back in the seat, and welcome to you both.
Hello.
And we've also got a very young guest with us today. We've got 2.5 guests. We've got Ivor here too, so I'm sure he'll give us a bit of input during the show. So the first thing we're going to talk about, folks, obviously, is the awful news that came out of New Zealand this week, and we had 49 people shot dead and dozens more injured in 2 attacks in Christchurch mosques. Now, the gunman live streamed this attack, which is bad enough in itself, but more disturbingly, some of the news outlets have been using this footage as well, and you're thinking, well, what is it we've come to that this is the kind of level of news that people think you want? But sadly, across the globe, we're seeing more and more right-wing extremists. What do you think's causing this?
Well, I think it's been a slow build-up over years and years and years. I've now been elected for 20 years, for example, and one of the first sort of campaigns that I got involved in after I got elected was when there was the asylum seeker dispersal up to the Dungavel, which at that time was in my patch. And I was just absolutely appalled at the system that was allowing dawn raids with families with children, that was putting innocent people in detention. And then the level of appeals, which meant that they shouldn't have even been lifted in the first place. And of course that resulted in the Glasgow Girls campaign and stuff. But so there's been a build-up of nasty, horrible rhetoric from both politicians and the media to some extent about people, people who come to our country. And the frustration of not being allowed in Scotland to behave differently and do things differently because it's a reserved matter is awful. And I think that kind of thing has just carried on through. And then you had the rise of UKIP, and I have to say, helped along by, well, mainstream media. You just need to look at BBC Question Time and how often UKIP were on it, for example. There's a bit of me thinks maybe with society generally sleepwalked into it, but there's another bit of me thinks it was quite clearly directed by some. And I think it's built up, not just in Scotland, UK, but wider. And there's this whole sense of people coming and trying to take what's ours, and it's horrible. It's just nasty. So I think there's quite clearly a lot of folk to blame for the feelings that other people are getting. Nobody's to blame for somebody that would go and do what this guy in New Zealand did. Of course they're not. There's something very, very bad there. I don't think you can apportion blame to any other individual. But there's a whole feeling in society. Social media, of course, helps spread that. So I think that's another issue. And back to how you started this conversation, the idea that mainstream media were using some of these issues, I just find sick and awful. And oh my goodness, they should know better.
Yeah. Obviously, picking up what you said there, Linda, about how long this has been building up, and we saw things like the Joe Cox murder in 2016 and stuff. Alan, what do you think the media's role has been in creating this hostile environment?
Well, the media has basically created a situation whereby racism has become normalised. The drip, constant, steady stories about immigrants, about Muslims, so that people see headlines when they go into the news agents, and it just starts to become the most normal thing in the world. They don't even question it. But I think there's various different strands to this. One is the media's role. The other is capitalism's, because when capitalism fails as colossally as it has since 2008 and the banking crash, which has now disappeared in the memory hole, the largest theft in history, whereby trillions of pounds of public funds were channelled towards the financial sector to save it from its own excesses. History shows us that whenever you put enough people into poverty, there's a great polarisation between left and right, and the right tells a story about immigrants and marginalised groups, an easy story, about them being the ones to blame, and the left tells a story about how basically the structure of capitalism has failed us and we have to work together in order to try and bring the wealth back down towards the people. And unfortunately the right controls the media, so it's easier for them to transmit that story. So people are falling for the easy answers about immigration and about very vulnerable communities being responsible for, you know, the failure of society. That's what they're being told. But the other thing that really frustrates me is, especially in countries like the United States or Australia or New Zealand, when you get far-right white extremists talking about immigration, you feel like saying, hang on,
exactly.
how did you end up in this country?
Yeah, let's ask the Aborigines about that. Let's ask the Maoris about that.
Your country was formed in genocide, and in the case of the United States, genocide and slavery, these two enormous racist historical crimes, that should be the starting point of the conversation. And often that's completely erased in this very simplistic narrative about vulnerable communities being a threat to our way of life. And you're like, well, that's an interesting way that you've phrased that there. Completely ahistorical analysis. So there's a lot to discuss when it comes to these kind of issues, and these are the starting points: capitalism and historical racism.
In terms of obviously, you know, linking to the EU referendum, we saw that horrific poster that was almost Nazi-like of the accused people.
It was disgusting.
You know,
on the morning of Joe Cox's murder, that poster was released in the morning and it got forgotten about. And also, I believe that very morning as well, Britain First had issued a threat to Muslim politicians. This all happened in the same day, but obviously because of the murder itself, these things were obscured. And any other news day, these should have been looked at and looked at very, very closely, because they're all linked. These three aspects are linked. And as much as we hear about Muslim extremism and Islamic terrorism, more people are killed by white extremists than by Muslim fundamentalists. So that's not the public perception of things. And you have to ask, well, why is that not the public perception of things? Who is inflating one side and minimising the other?
And I suppose the other thing is, if you start looking at the underlying reasons why, and in terms of, you know, Britain, we've invaded every country in the world and gone in there and tried to take over, and, you know, and then they wonder why people have a complete dislike for us.
Yeah, but there's also back to this slow build-up thing as well. You know, that poster that day when Nigel Farage standing in front of it was just vile. But that came in the back of a lot of other things. That came in the back of Theresa May's Home Office saying immigrants go home. It came in the back of the Labour Party selling mugs as well that were, to me, racist. But there was also the mainstream political rhetoric. I mean, I remember being absolutely shocked when Gordon Brown was standing there talking about British jobs for British workers.
Right.
There's undertones in that kind of rhetoric. That's horrible. And round about that time as well, things sometimes come together. I was reading quite a lot about Oswald Mosley and the rise of fascism, you know, through that time. And I'm reading that and I'm looking at what's happening on mainstream TV and reading the mainstream press and thinking, we're starting to go down this road again.
Yep.
And it's really very scary. It's really very horrible. And I don't know if sometimes I think quite deeply about that stuff, because it's only, I mean, my grandfather was an immigrant that came over from Italy. And I always remember my granny saying to me, when there was quite a lot of Pakistani and Indian immigrants in the 60s, my granny saying to me, do you know that family across here are getting treated the same way me and your grandpa got treated in the 1920s? And it was this other coming in.
Italian immigrants,
yes,
presumably, right?
yes. And that was even pre-war, because Grandpa was interned along with lots of other Italians at the time. So there has always been a worry about immigrant populations coming in. A total forgetfulness that we've had immigrant populations from Scotland going out for centuries. So there's always been that, and I feel very, very strongly that there's an absolute responsibility on those that are elected and supposed to be running things to stop that kind of thing happening, and never, ever to stir it up in any way. I also think there's a responsibility on a public broadcaster like the BBC not to give so much space to someone like Nigel Farage and all his pals that spout that stuff and are allowed to do so. My own party, the SNP, third biggest party in Westminster, if you look at how many times they've been on BBC Question Time compared to UKIP, it's absolutely ludicrous, and they really all have to take a good hard look at themselves.
I think that goes back to what you said, Alan, about how it's normalised. You know, we're constantly seeing that right-wing rhetoric drip fed to us
and
daily.
the linchpin is Labour, I think, and you referenced the tough on immigration mobs that
ones.
Labour had. They had Miliband campaign, actually. And then before you had Gordon Brown saying British jobs are for British workers. Now, if the Labour movement is for anything, it's to stand up for the working class. And that doesn't just mean the white working class.
Exactly.
Because, as you say, Pakistani immigrants are working class. Refugees who've come to this country who are trying to work are working class. All of these people are working class. So when you start getting Jeremy Corbyn, a socialist, saying things like, well, you know, when we have immigrants who come to this country, they depress wages, boom, you've legitimised UKIP.
Sort out.
In a shot, you've legitimised UKIP. Because every working class person who feels that they're not getting paid enough is going, well, Jeremy Corbyn's just told us it's because of immigrants. So Labour conceded the argument.
They did.
That's been the big problem here. Labour should have been standing and saying, no, immigration is beneficial to this country and here are the reasons why. But they were cowards.
What Labour should have been
doing.
What Labour should have been doing when they were in power, what they should be fighting to do when they're the chief opposition in the UK, is fighting for employment rights and decent employment legislation that stops people getting really low wages for jobs that are very, very important. That's what they should be arguing for. They can look at other models, across even the European Union that have much stricter labour laws that means that people cannot be accused of undercutting other people. And that's the way to do it.
Obviously, Linda, the Scottish Government have taken a different viewpoint of immigration, and we, as a country, tend to welcome people here, and we realise that anybody coming to Scotland and living and working is contributing to our economy. I can't remember who it was that said that what's the definition of a Scotsman, anybody that wants to be, kind of thing. So the Scottish Government they've tried to take that different viewpoint.
Well, there's a recognition that Scotland has a very unique position. When you look at, for all sorts of reasons that we don't have time to go into in this programme, that's another programme, for all sorts of reasons, Scotland's population has not grown, and our demographic is worrying for the future in terms of an ageing population. So we need people with skills, of course we do, but we need people just in mainstream jobs. We need people right across the employment spectrum. And, people that come here to live and work, this is their home. I can feel physically sick, actually, when I look at friends that I have in the Scots Italian community who have lived and built businesses here for decades, employed people, and they're having to fill in a blooming form to be allowed to stay in their home. And that's right across, all the European nationals that are here contributed to this country. That must feel absolutely awful. And it's just sickening to me.
And obviously, one of the biggest Brexiteers is Jacob Rees-Mogg, and the reality is he's been making money out of Brexit and pushing for it. But people, the man, women in the street are going to be seriously impacted by Brexit, and he just doesn't seem to care.
Well, of course he doesn't. He represents the British upper class, the landed gentry, privilege that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. And when that privilege feels that it can't achieve its objective through democratic means, it will always use reactionary forces, it will always use fascism to defend itself. What might happen is I might take this boy just out for a couple of minutes. You can try, go for it. Just for a couple of minutes to settle him, but we'll still be able to continue the conversation. Obviously. Oh, he's gone for the glasses. That's nice and shiny. We'll stick the cap on that. So yeah, that's the story that's been told for hundreds of years. That the right wing, the privileged in society will use street violence. They'll use working class reactionaries as cover for their own objectives, and that's what happened. That's what happened during the Second World War.
The
And obviously-
establishment always do fine. Fuck Rees-Mogg and what's his man, him with the hair, Boris Johnson.
Boris Johnson.
They always do okay. The establishment are always fine, and it's, you know, it's all part of that capitalism argument that Alan was making earlier.
Yeah.
And they will protect their investments, come what may, even
Well,
while the rest of us suffer.
Well, we know he's already moved investments out with, and is it not Nigel Farage that got his children other passports?
There we are.
You know, and people are
And then
they're
when you
making
look
sure
at
they're okay.
some of the newspaper owners as well,
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
they're all in the same
Aye.
bunch.
Yeah, that's a con.
And obviously, sticking with Brexit, you know, you every week you just think to yourself, this can't get any more mad, but actually it does. You know, Theresa May has lost 2 votes already. She's now going for a 3rd attempt this week. What do you think her chances are, Alan?
I mean, to be quite honest with you, I can't keep track of it.
Yeah.
I mean, I've long since understood what is going on with the various machinations in Parliament. All I know is it doesn't seem as though there's a majority in Parliament for any kind of deal, any kind of specific deal. They can't vote to take no deal off the table, because no deal by default is what will happen if a deal hasn't been reached. So they can talk all they like about, well, we're not going to allow no deal to happen, but that will happen unless there's an extension of Article 50, which we need the permission of the EU to have. And the EU aren't going to give us any kind of extension to Article 50 without there being a good reason. So it's difficult to see any kind of way ahead, really. It seems as though everything's been tried. Extending the deadline is going to achieve what precisely? A general election is going to achieve what precisely? There's been a complete failure of politics. And when I speak to people, no matter how they voted in the EU referendum, whether they voted Leave or voted Remain, every single person in the country thinks this is an absolute shambles. Now that tells you something. It's almost in a funny way. We hear about how the country is divided, and in some ways it is. But I've not spoken to anybody, whatever their political persuasion, who does not think that our politicians have abjectly failed us.
Yeah.
That in a funny way is uniting the
Yeah,
country, because
yeah.
politics it's failed.
Yeah.
And they can't hide it anymore.
And I think one of the worrying things is that, you know, we appear to be held to ransom by the DUP, and my understanding is they're currently in other discussions about more money. I mean, that kind of situation is just ludicrous, Linda, that this is what
Well, what many of them are 10. You know, up for another bribe. Meanwhile, all the stuff that's going on, the concerns in Ireland and the north of Ireland about the backstop and the border issue, and all, they're sitting in wee rooms trying to do deals. It's just, it's absolutely appalling. And again, 10 of them. You know, what about Scotland? We just get completely ignored at every turn. You know, there we have with Scotland's party down there in vast numbers compared to the rest, ignored, turned away from, don't even get broadcast. It's just awful. I was at a school on Friday actually in East Kilbride, St Andrews and St Bride's, 4th year modern studies pupils. They talked more sense about Brexit than I have heard in a long, long time. And you know, and here we are still in the midst of this chaos. She's going back next week with the same deal, seems. And meanwhile, we're told we can't go back and have a referendum. So the people aren't entitled to have another shot at it, but she'll just keep going and going and going.
And that's seen as being
And I
democracy.
think my own view is that she will get it through. Aye, and one of her chaps, they all just merge into one for me, was getting interviewed last week and talking about if the Prime Minister doesn't get a deal, it's an affront to democracy. No, it's not. It's them that are an affront to democracy.
Yeah.
Absolute affront to democracy.
And I think Alan
I'm getting
touched
angry
on.
now.
I think that's part of the problem. You know, Alan touched on, you know, just about the failure of government. But you know, when you actually look at the Labour Party as well, they had an opportunity here to be able to try and do something to change this course. And A, they've just sat back, but B, in some cases, they've almost supported the government in the actions they're taking, and it just
They've
seems...
completely enabled May's government. They haven't acted as an opposition. What could have happened after the failure, the last time that May brought that deal to Parliament? Corbyn had an open goal. He could have stood up and said, well, if Parliament can't decide, the people have to decide. We have to take this back to the people in the form of another referendum. And he'd already been sort of making noises that he would support a people's vote. And then what happened? He didn't even mention it. So Corbyn has demonstrated an absolute failure of opposition and of leadership himself on this issue. Him and me are indistinguishable in this. And he said, well, we'll negotiate a different Brexit deal with Europe. Well, what's it going to look like? How different is it going to be? Give us the details. No, sorry. We'll just have to wait on that.
Yeah, and then the other thing that's been irritating me on the Scottish Parliament level is we keep hearing all these excuses for Labour MPs, mainly in the north of England and in other bits, saying, well, we're just sticking up for our constituents. We have to put the arguments that our constituents have. Meanwhile, we've got all these Scottish Tories sitting in Scotland's Parliament who are completely ignoring the wishes of their constituents because every single constituency voted Remain. Most of these MSPs in Holyrood and the Tory benches said they were Remainers. And they're completely dissing the will of the people that elected them there. So the amount of hypocrisy that's around this is just...
And there's a very interesting contrast to be made, I think, between the DUP and the Scottish Conservatives who've been elected to Westminster, who we were told would vote as a bloc to protect Scotland's interests. So the DUP snap their fingers and they get another £1 billion for Northern Ireland, even though the Northern Irish Assembly is shut down. So where's the money going? There's another question. But if the Scottish Conservatives MPs had refused to back the government or threatened to withdraw their support in the way that the DUP had, Scotland could be getting those billions.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't even occur to them to do that because it's no in them. So the DUP, for all their faults, and I'm absolutely no fan of the DUP have managed to get all this money for Northern Ireland simply by using the power that they have. And the Scottish Conservatives have utterly failed in that regard, even though they claim to be standing up for Scotland.
Yeah. I mean, I think just picking up your point, Linda, I mean, obviously any elected member is there to represent their constituency and the people in their constituency. But overall as well, given the information they have access to, do you not think they have a duty of care as well to know that we should not be going down a route that's going to seriously harm their constituents?
Absolutely. Every elected politician is going to face at some point, and I've faced it myself over the years, at some point is going to face a decision. Do I vote for what most of my constituents who have been in touch, not most of your constituents because you don't know, most who have been in touch want me to do, or do I actually have to look at the bigger picture? And, for me, that argument always comes down to, I've always been very open and honest about my principles and my beliefs. I got elected, so if it's something that attacks my own principles and beliefs, I have to go with that and do what I believe to be right. Every person faces that, but you've got a rump of Tory MSPs sitting in Holyrood who know, they must know, because these folk aren't stupid, they must know the problems that Brexit is going to cause for Scotland, particular problems for Scotland. So they're not even looking at the bigger picture.
Or in contrast, does that suit their agenda?
Well, it depends what their agenda is, yes.
Their agenda being, I mean, to be fair, my feeling about the Conservative plan for Scotland is to run Scotland down to the point where independence is impossible.
Yes.
That's why it was interesting that before the 2014 referendum they were saying, well, you wouldn't get all these green energy subsidies from Westminster that you're getting just now. And then as soon as the no vote was in, they whipped them away, because that is a potential industry that could allow Scotland to thrive, and they can't have that.
Remember, the oil was running out.
The oil's been running out since 1973.
The oil was running out.
So, they're trying to weaken Scotland to the point where actually the hole that we will be in will be too deep to climb back out, and the whole idea of independence will be inconceivable. That's the Tory plan for Scotland. And unfortunately, because of the no vote in 2014, we've given these people the power of the fate of the country. This is what I was trying to tell people in 2014. I was getting a lot of, well, what's going to happen if Scotland votes for independence? What's the country going to look like? And of course, these are reasonable questions and we have to have answers to them. But I would then say to them, well, what do you think is going to happen if Scotland votes no? We've given away all our power. We've actually allowed these people to have a mandate from the people of Scotland to say, well, we can do whatever the hell we like to you now. And that's exactly what they're doing. Every time we question what they're doing, they say, Scotland voted decisively in 2014 to remain part of the UK. Aye, that's right.
And we also voted decisively to remain part of the European Union. That European Union that we were told we would be kicked out of if we became an independent nation. Oh, look what's happened.
Yeah, exactly.
We've got to keep strong though. You know, we've got to keep getting that message out to people so that people realise just what a successful independent nation Scotland could be. Because it's very, very clear to anyone that looks at it properly and sees behind the propaganda that gets pumped out day and daily.
Yeah. Picking up on the Northern Ireland part, obviously we saw this week that the Northern Ireland Public Prosecution Service has examined 19 cases and they are charging one former British paratrooper with the killings. Now, again, I think this highlights that, you know, why the Brexit process is so important when it comes to the Irish question. Now, many of these communities and peoples in Ireland are still very raw about what happened back then on both sides. But it has to be a priority, surely, that Ireland is safeguarded and we don't go back to where we were 10, 15 years ago.
It's a real concern, you know, for the last, what's nearly 3 years now, I've been our Parliament's, or one of our Parliament's reps on what's called the British Irish Parliamentary Assembly, which was a talking shop, is a talking shop of all the different parliaments in the islands, and it was part of the Good Friday Agreement. So it's valid, talking shops are valid sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's been there, but since, of course, the Brexit thing, that's the sole topic of discussion almost. And the palpable concern of Irish politicians and indeed some Northern Ireland politicians about what's going to happen on their island is there. Serious concerns. You know, they talk about the reality of what it was like. They talk about the reality of what it could become again. And it's really, really frightening. And on a couple of occasions we've had UK government ministers with Ireland responsibilities over to talk, and I have sat there stunned at the lack of understanding that they appear to have about the seriousness of this, the potential of where this could be going. So I'm very, very worried about it, because some of these wounds are still fairly shallow in Ireland in terms of remembrance, in terms of real hurt that is shallow there and can come to the fore again. And there's also, of course, those nasty folks, we've all got them, who will take advantage of any chaotic situation.
A couple of letter bombs being sent by the IRA, one of which was sent to Glasgow University, which is a change, because Scotland was never targeted before by the IRA. So I don't know if this is a sort of warning, look, if the UK proceeds down the road that it's going on, we're going to be back, or what the motive is, because I don't think any of them have actually explained what the motive was behind these letter bombs. But it's certainly indicative that after decades of a ceasefire like that they're targeting mainland Britain. So we're looking at a future of political chaos. Essentially, that's what Brexit has brought. The centrifugal force of Brexit is so strong; it's just throwing debris in its wake. It's split the Tory party, it's split the Labour Party. Parliament has come to a standstill. Politics in Britain has come to a standstill. I couldn't tell you a single policy that's been passed by the Westminster Parliament in the last 2 years because they've been so snarled up by Brexit. We're now possibly looking at a return to sectarian violence as a result of a failure to agree about the backstop. You know, and this, I feel like trying to go back to every no voter in 2014 and say, this is what we've voted for. This is what Scotland has voted for. Are you happy with this? Is this what you feel you were promised in 2014? You may have believed you were voting in good faith for a strong and stable UK and a strong and stable within that. I knew at the time that was a joke. But here we are, this is the reality of the Britain that we're in. Are you happy with that? And I think that's the question that we have to pose to no voters.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I'm sitting here, I shouldn't have smiled at that point, but he just threw up right down here.
Oh, did it?
Bless.
Do you know what?
On camera.
Do you know what this reminds me of? It's a bit like when you meet up with your pals in a restaurant and one of them's brought their baby and you're having a big serious political discussion. And then, of course, you know, you get vomited in. What I'll do is I'll take him out for a couple of minutes and walk him up and down the hall.
It's all about his future at the end of the day.
Exactly.
You know, and this is real life. This is the future.
Of course.
And I'll tell you just before you go out, Alan, what's been going through Westminster is pensioners getting shafted again in terms of benefits.
Pensioners who so loyally vote.
It's disability allowances and all the rest of it. Getting cut. That's what's going under the radar through Westminster while we've got all this chaos going on.
Yeah, and I think one of the crucial things about that, Linda, is they keep referring to pensions as a benefit, when in actual fact it's not a benefit. You've paid into that. It's actually a contract with the government that you pay in that, and this is what you'll get back out. And then that money, in effect, has been stolen from many, many women who now are in real poverty because of that.
Well, yeah, I mean, what's called the waspy woman. I'm a waspy woman myself, actually. Yes, people enter into a contract with the state about their pensions, about, you know, we have the NHS as well. These are all contractual things, social contracts that are just being disregarded. And, you know, quite regularly they're putting through changes to the pension stuff under the radar, as I say. I mean, there was the one where they're changing the payments where couples live together and reach pension age. That's taking money away from people. They're now talking about not raising the thresholds for pensions. Again, that's taking money away from people. And I know that some of my own colleagues at Westminster are fighting that case just now. So,
and we have one of the worst records of pension paid out in the whole of the world.
Oh, we don't. Well, the whole of the sort of developed world, if you want to call it that. You know, compared to the rest of Europe, our pensions they aren't great. Yeah. And you know, so and this latest thing they've done affects private pensions as well. It's not just the state pension.
Which doesn't make sense, because if you have a retired person or a retired couple who have money in their pocket, they're going to spend that in the local economy, and that's going to help. It just seems ridiculous that actually you're making it harder.
But that's one of the problems, I think, of our politics in general. And it's one of the things in Scotland that, and I'll be gracious and generous and say cross-party is recognised, is that you have to look at the bigger picture. That's why there's been such an emphasis on the early years, for example. But one of the issues in this country is everything is looked at just in silos of budgets. You know, so that's the budget for pensions. It doesn't then relate into what that pension paid out to people will put into the budget that you judge the economy by, for example. Everything is, the whole system is about government cabinet secretaries fighting for their bit of the cake, fighting their colleagues for their bit of the cake. Nothing gets looked at in the bigger picture. I mean, that was one of the reasons that the health and social care stuff in Scotland was put together, because there's a recognition that even here, and I've seen it over and over again, you know, the NHS Scotland or whatever health board fighting for their bit of the money, the councils fighting for their bit of the money. And there are issues where if they actually work together, the bigger picture would be that you can spend money sometimes to save money later. Makes sense to me, but it's a hard job to change all these cultures.
And I think, you know, the ironic thing is, going back to 2014, the pensions was one of the things they kept scaring everybody with. If you vote, you know, yes, your pension's in jeopardy. And then we go down this road and now we look at where everybody is, and it just seems awful that people were lied to.
Well, that's 2 referenda we've had since 2014, with the independence referendum, and then we had the EU referendum. And it's become very, very clear that both referendum campaigns were dodgy in terms of information that was put out by the establishment. First of all, to tell us that we couldn't be independent, and then the next time round to tell us what the wonderful benefits would be to coming out of the European Union, both have been proved to be false on many, many grounds.
Yeah. Just to pick up on something you said earlier on, we were talking about the SNP being the third largest party in Westminster, and there was a bit of a Twitter furore this week when the BBC, every time Ian Blackford got up to speak, the BBC cut away from it. Do you think this is blatant propaganda?
I think it's a mixture. There is propaganda there, of course there is. We all know about that. In fact, I understand there's a report in the Sunday Herald today about the BBC during a referendum campaign deliberately downplaying the positive side of independence by someone who was very, very close to it. I'll read it properly later. So some of it is propaganda, but part of it is, sadly, they're just never thought were important enough to take any notice of. I think that's a big part of it. You know, we are treated like we don't really matter. There's no recognition of Scotland as a very distinct historic nation. There's no recognition of even the fact that even since the Act of Union, Scotland has maintained its own legal system, its own education system, etc. They just don't get it. And I have, over the years, seen that many, many times when I've gone to meetings in London. The shock on people's faces when they realise things like that. Top politicians who look at you as if there's something very strange about you because you think you've got something to stand up for that might actually not be of benefit to them. So there's an element of they just don't get it, and there's an element of propaganda.
I think, obviously, the BBC are the state broadcaster, but surely it's a dereliction of their duty not to report the facts. They should not be there playing down things or putting their own spin and stuff. They should be there telling us the facts, and then people can make up their own minds.
Well, it's a public broadcaster after all, yes. The facts. I suppose it's their version of what the facts are, isn't it? Which is quite a difficult call. I can't remember who it was that said that famous phrase, economical with the truth. Cutting away and not allowing somebody a say is being economical with the facts because the facts haven't been allowed to be put forward. The total denigration of the SNP, my own party, over the years by both Westminster and becoming increasingly apparent by the BBC is it being economical with the truth? Is it being disingenuous? Is it just not realising? Or is it a deliberate establishment thing? I think it's a bit of them all. When you look at the establishment down in London in the southeast, you look at the main political parties, they have wee turns at being in government, but actually, see if push comes to shove, they never do enough to finish the other side. So there's that, and you add in the media moguls and the
like
press
that
with all
Westminster
that.
bubble, isn't it?
Absolutely, and it's all part of the establishment that tells the rest of us, and not just Scotland, but also Wales and regions of England as well, and the north of Ireland, tells them what's good for them because they know best. I've sat at meetings where we've even tried to tell Ireland, an independent, successful nation within the EU, what they should be doing because they know best. Well, one thing this whole debacle has proved is that they know nothing.
Yeah. And another big story this week, obviously, was the Lib Dems. They've not had a good week.
Yeah.
So their leader, Vince Cable, he's announced he's stepping down in May, which will be interesting to see who replaces him. Apparently, he says it's to pave the way for a new generation. But we also saw David Steele suspended from the party over the Cyril Smith revelations. Now, he admitted that he was aware that Cyril was a child abuser, but failed to assess whether he was a risk to children and basically did nothing. We also found out that MI5 knew about it and did nothing. How could anybody, politician or not look at a situation and put a child at the centre of that and say, is a child at risk? What do we need to do about it?
I was really shocked by that. I just don't know what the answer to your question is because it just you can't imagine behaving that way yourself. I wasn't shocked at Cyril Smith. I mean, over the years, it wasn't just one report in Private Eye. Over the years in Private Eye, they have had a go at Cyril Smith over and over and over. That's when I picked it up years and years ago. So that's always been there. And when I saw David Steele, the man's over 80 now, giving his evidence, I was like, how did you just let that go? I just don't understand. Even then, and I've heard people saying, well, it was different times and it was this and that. Well, maybe that was different times. That doesn't make it acceptable that you let that go. But there's another element to it. Because comparatively recently, but it's over years now, we've had much more of a recognition of these things. We've had scandals come out. The Medhamsley scandal, which is a scandal in the north of England, is ongoing. They've been having trials for years. You look at some of the religious institutions. Child abuse for years now has been getting talked about, yet still nobody told the truth about Cyril Smith as they knew it. Even before he died, we were still talking openly about child abuse scandals, and that man's reputation was allowed to stand while he was alive and things. And I'm really shocked, shocked by David Steele.
David had put him forward for a knighthood after he knew that information, but even worse still, apparently Margaret Thatcher knew about it as well and obviously did nothing about it. But it's not even just them. That's part of a bigger culture of what's been happening down there. And we've heard about the different investigations over the last, we're talking about their child abuse in Westminster, the last few years, and we even hear things like paperwork going missing, and really I think the credibility of the government probably is at rock bottom in terms of how it's handled Brexit, but just how we've handled all these scandals that have come forward. Everything is swept under the carpet. Nobody wants to deal with stuff face on and say, do you know what? Yeah, it happened, and here's what we're going to look at, and here's how we're going to stop it. It just almost as if, let's not, a bit like what you said earlier on, Alan, about other stuff, let's not talk about it. Let's not
what
talk
I was
about
saying
it.
while you were out there, Alan, is there's an establishment at the heart of the UK state, not just politicians, but a wider establishment that all looks after each other and buries stuff. So
it's a great book by Owen Jones on that very topic. He talks about how this establishment was formed and how it seized political power and how it's perpetuated itself. But I think, obviously this is a very particular case that we're talking about here, but if you look at it in the context of things like the Westminster expenses scandal, the phone hacking scandal, the banking crash in 2008, all sorts of revelations about institutionalised racism in the Met. It's almost like the entire upper layer of British society is so incredibly corrupt that, like we were saying earlier, it's almost become normalised that people just go, oh yeah, they're all at it, they're all corrupt, and it loses its power to shock. And you actually have to stop and say, wait a minute, why are we letting these people rule us? This is, this is evidence that the entire British system is utterly irredeemable, and it really is. And in the Lib Dems specifically, obviously I can't talk about the truth of these particular matters, but I'm a former Lib Dem voter. I've never voted Labour, I've always voted Lib Dems at general elections until obviously they started propping up the Tories, and I thought, well, they're never getting my vote again. And then, some of their behaviour during and since the 2014 referendum. I remember having a debate at Glasgow University a few days, maybe about 4 days before the vote in 2014. And Willie Rennie was on the other side. He was leading the debate for the Union. And, I'd always subscribed to the view that Willie Rennie was a kind of cuddly figure, nice guy, sort of like your kindly uncle. And I might have disagreed with the Lib Dems getting into relationship with the Tories, but Willie Rennie, he's probably one of the good guys. And the ferocity of the attack, he actually stood up and said, unprompted, I accuse the Yes campaign of being cowards. Now imagine Alex Salmond had used that word about people who were thinking about voting no, cowards. You imagine the front page headlines that we've come from. Alex Salmond accuses no voters of being cowards. Nobody even batted an eyelid.
Why were they cowards?
Because we were cutting and running, because we weren't staying to help out and make the UK a better place.
Oh,
because
see?
because
All
we were
right.
only thinking about ourselves, rather than actually doing the spade work of trying. I mean, we've only been in the union for 300 plus years. It's not like we've given it a shot. But there you go. In order to try and make Scotland a better place, a more democratic place, and make Scottish democracy more accountable to people, that's cowardice in the views of the Lib Dems. And you've already got the double standards about a second EU referendum, but no, you Scotland, you can't have another referendum. In fact, the SNP have to completely stop talking about it.
That was just ludicrous, wasn't it?
Or we're going to vote against your budget. I mean, this idea that the Lib Dems are the good guys is an utter nonsense, and I feel kind of betrayed by them, given that I was such a loyal voter of them for so many years.
And I think it's really strange that there's this argument that the SNP need to stop talking about independence, given as that is what the party was set up for. They're never going to stop talking about independence. It just seems
there's
bizarre.
a quote from Ruth Davidson where she said, it's a perfectly reasonable and honourable position for the SNP to take that they argue for independence. And that quote has just, it vanished into thin air, because suddenly that's not the view that any unionist has taken. It's like, you have to surrender. You have to surrender your principal core belief, or we're going to do everything in our power to try and snuff this movement out.
Well, that's right. That's what's ludicrous, in our Parliament, saying that we should surrender that power, surrender our core principles and beliefs. Can you imagine if I stood up in the Parliament and said, right, okay, I think the Labour Party should give up being the party of the workers. I think the Labour Party should stop talking about Keir Hardie, and I think the Liberals should stop talking about the things they brought in, because it was actually them that ushered in the National Health Service and stuff. I don't think the Liberals should ever mention that again. It's just a ludicrous position. But maybe at the heart of it is they can say these things because they don't have any core principles. So it doesn't enter their head that there's something that means so much to you that you will never let it go. They just don't understand.
No, and that's interesting. You said earlier on about how they tell everybody else what to do, and that just seems to be their mantra. But this week we also saw Shell's CEO paid more than 17.2 million, which was a 126% pay rise, the largest in the company's history. Now, interestingly, the company said the pay was appropriate after they reported an underlying profit of £16.3 billion, their highest level since 2014, which kind of makes a big mockery of the oil running out rhetoric, Alan.
Well, exactly. I mean, it's the curse of oil. Scotland seems to be the only country in the world that has been cursed with this resource that every other country in the world would be crying out for. You only have to look at the history of the UK government on Scotland's oil, the Macron report. I mean, I actually have to say, when I found that out about the Macron report, an independent report that was published in the 70s, which concluded that we're a Scottish nation to nationalise its oil industry, would be one of the richest countries in the world. And you only have to compare what we've got to what Norway has got. Unionists are never tired of telling us about the size of our deficit, Scotland's deficit, not a deficit that's been run up on our behalf, but our deficit. And I feel like saying to them, let's say you're right, let's say Scotland has got this deficit. Where did the money go? Because Norway discovered oil at the same time as we did, and they've got the strongest public finances in the world, and we've got this deficit. So where did the money go? Scotland didn't spend it. Where did it go? And the reality is, it underwrote Thatcher's programme in the 1980s, a programme which deindustrialised Scotland and put thousands and thousands of people into the scrap heap. So our oil wealth was actually used against us to destroy us. That's the reality of the situation. Why you would then trust that same establishment with the future management of Scotland's oil resources is beyond me. But then in 2014 we heard a lot about the volatility of the oil price, and you can't base an economy in this, and suddenly none of the unionists are talking about oil anymore because there's future bonanzas that have yet to be tapped. And as you can see, there are people who are making a great deal of money off a resource that could be used to improve the lives of the people of Scotland.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And just picking up on that point, I think, taking the oil out of the issue, that is actually an obscene amount of money for one person. to receive, given that in Scotland, where the oil is, we have massive poverty and people going to food banks and one person gets £17 million a year. It just seems like it's that old thing of the rich getting richer and the poor just getting left behind.
Well, the division between rich and poor has just widened and widened, hasn't it? And yet, it is obscene, but it's beyond even our comprehension, isn't it, how one person can... What do you do to earn that? I mean, granted, the man's probably brilliant at what he does and all the rest of it. Other people that get that kind of ludicrous salary, brilliant at what they do, yeah, okay. But I don't think there's any level of brilliance that justifies that. I really don't. And I also find it quite difficult to get my head around the fact that somebody would accept it. Maybe that's a bit nasty of me. Maybe the man does wonderful things with his excess change. I don't know.
Maybe, hopefully.
There's a graph that I saw on
Just not right.
Twitter recently, and it was looking at the wealth of the 1%, the elite in society, and throughout the 20th century and beyond. And essentially, it was you know, so it goes up a wee bit and down a wee bit and up a wee bit and down a wee bit. And in the 70s, in the mid 70s, when we were told Britain was a basket case, it was at its lowest, and then you get to 1980.
Right.
And then you get to the 2000s, and in the last 5, 6, 7 years, an enormous spike. Everything since Thatcherism and Reaganism, every policy of the governments of the UK and the United States has been about enriching the few at the expense of everybody else. Capitalism is a mechanism that is essentially used to transfer wealth and resources and power from the majority of people in society up to the few. That's what capitalism is. So you can't talk about poverty and you can't talk about riches without talking about the structure that we're all governed by, which is capitalism. That's the reality of what it looks like. It's impossible for capitalism to enrich the many, because otherwise it would be socialism.
Absolutely.
That's the difference.
And obviously, there's the argument of the environment, and do we really want to be using all this oil, and that's a whole different thing. But this week we saw, I think, was it 1 million students skipping school on Friday, and they were doing their climate strikes. Now, obviously, great to see young people getting actively involved in the issue, but you kind of wonder how really effective that could be, and did it need to be a school strike? Could it have been a demonstration out with school, or what do you think that kind of action would really achieve?
I think it was okay. I was all right with it. I don't think it should be something that we see on a regular basis for issues that come up, but I think for something like climate change, which affects the whole world, which affects every one of these children, I say good on them. I think it was an excellent thing for them to do and to raise awareness. Now, yes, you will find that there will be a lot of the youngsters that did it that won't carry on in that campaigning mode, but there'll be quite a few of them there, and I heard a few of them talking in the radio. I was well impressed. That will really tap into this, and this will matter hugely to them, and they'll be activists, and they're the people I would hope that will keep going, and we'll listen to them in the future. And so I've been worried over the last few years about the lack of activism, with students, for example. So this is good. This is good that you can do this, and what I want to see is that it makes people listen, and that it perhaps makes a difference, because then they see that a democracy is about people being able to make a difference, and that they've got part in that, because everything else that's happening is tamping that down. So it's quite a good counterbalance.
Do you think, Alan, that governments and big businesses will actually pay attention?
No.
I mean, we saw this week...
That does make it pointless.
No.
Because the purpose of this is to politicise a generation, that raise their consciousness, and you can only really do that when you are involved in a mass participation. I mean, I can remember, actually I have to say, I think the young generation are far, far more political than my generation was at their age. I mean, we were Generation X, everything was ironic and blank and detached, and You know, politics was uncool. It was deeply uncool. Absolutely. If you met somebody who was political, it was just a bit like... and all the way through the 90s, this is how we ended up with Tony Blair.
Yeah.
Because he was symptomatic of the sort of generation of youth. We had Britpop, we had dance music, you know, it was... And we were generally convinced that our generation was going to be wealthier than our parents' generation, who had been wealthier than their parents' generation, and that society was getting better. And of course that was all an illusion. Of course it was, because the rich were working behind the scenes to consolidate their power, while we were, you know, raving. And very quickly the illusion becomes dispelled, and the real turning point for me, there was two things. One was the book No Logo, by Naomi Klein, which was, you know, like a detonation, because suddenly you're aware that all these brands that you've grown up with, like Coca-Cola and Disney and McDonald's and Nike, are actually getting up to all sorts of horrible malpractices. So it was using the language of consumerism to expose the system. And the second thing was the Iraq War. So I would have been in my 20s, which would have been when the Iraq War happened, maybe about 27, something like that. And I was starting to piece things together, and then that happened, and I was like, hang on a minute, Iraq isn't a threat to us. We can't just invade and destabilise a regime without you know, the permission of the international community, because America's told us to. What's going on? That was a very obvious crime on Britain's part that I felt like I had to speak out against. So I went down in the march in London, something like 1.5 million people, and it's only when you're in that amount of people who are protesting and singing and chanting and marching, and there's an enormous positivity around you, that you realise just how powerful the masses actually are. Now, of course, Tony Blair ignored it and went ahead anyway, but that was the moment, I think, that effectively killed New Labour. Even although the Iraq War went ahead, their credibility was gone after that, utterly gone. Certainly in the eyes of me and every young person that I knew. And I think you can draw a straight line between the Iraq War protests right through to the anti-austerity protests and things like the Make Poverty History March and the, you know, what was the one in Central Park a few years ago? No, it was maybe about 7 or 8 years ago, and it was a sort of anti-capitalist camp. I can't remember the name.
And they had smaller ones in different places. Yes, I do remember that.
Yes. Can't remember the name, but that all these different manifestations of youth protest, right up to these climate change marches, can be traced back to Iraq. And I think I would always be in favour of young people protesting, because even if the protest is ineffectual, it raises their consciousness, and it gets them all talking, and it gets them all linked up and being aware of their power.
Okay, folks, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. It's been a quick hour, so I would just like to thank Linda and Alan and Ivor for coming along today. He's one of our best behaved guests so far, I think. So look out during the week for Scotland at 7, and hopefully we'll see you again next week on the Full Scottish, and have a really nice St Patrick's Day. Yay.